Huck and I want to welcome you all to our tide pool together with Warner Fletcher. And now for the rest of the story. We can't wait. So many of you joined us last summer, maybe last June or July, I think, for one of Tide Pool's first Zoom events when Caroline Camugis and Jim Dempsey focused on the life of Worcester's Scofield Thayer in the Dial collection. And that was sort of the backdrop of their talk was Jim Dempsey's book, which we just happen to have at Tide Pool Bookshop, The Tortured Life of Scofield Thayer. And although put on hold due to COVID, the documentary that he and Caroline are both working on called Stroke of Genius, Scofield Thayer. Warner was at that Zoom, and afterwards he had a stroke of genius himself. And that was to let us all in on the story of the settling of Scofield Thayer's estate. And while the settling of an estate doesn't typically sound like the stuff of which exciting Zooms are made, the story, I understand, of this settlement does indeed sound exciting, particularly when it's in the hands of Warner. After Warner's presentation, there will be time for Q&A. And while it would be great if you would stay on mute during his talk, afterward, feel free to unmute yourselves to ask any questions or to make any comments. Actually, not any comments, most comments, but that you might have. And if you would prefer, though, not to ask your question aloud and reveal yourself, you can also use the chat button at the bottom and write your question. And I think Huck will be there to relay your question. Excellent. Relay your question to Warner. So, Warner, we can't tell you how much we appreciate your doing this, and I'm gonna hand it right over to you.
Well, thank you, and I would take your appreciation right now, frankly. This was an interesting case, and that's probably the last thing you ever want to hear your lawyer say to you is, you know, Joe, this is a very interesting case. Because all you think of then is time and money. But Bob Whipple, my dad had been the attorney that had handled the guardianship proceedings for Scofield, which were out of the Worcester Probate Court. And then Bob Whipple had taken over. And then when Scofield died in '82, we settled the estate. So Bob was the primary attorney. And, you know, I can tell you, he said, if you believe me, that this was the most interesting case he ever had in his career. And I've had less of a career, but I'm here in live person, and I'll say you it's the same thing. It is interesting in a number of key issues. So for some of you probably don't know Scofield Thayer or didn't have the opportunity to join Tide Pool back in July or August when Jim and Carol talked about him. So I thought what I'd do is just do a very brief synopsis, a few historical dates that would help you with Scofield Thayer. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about some of the issues in the settlement of the estate, three in particular, which I really have never, I read about them in law books in cases, but I've never seen them come up in actual real cases that we handled, except for this particular estate. And then I thought I would just comment, one of the issues that came out of this was the loss of the collection, the Dial collection to New York, and was that unfair? Was the city and the museum given short shrift on that? And then lastly, and you may get my drift with the last portion, is that basically the Thayer family was pretty important in this community. And at the end of the day, maybe from a 1,000-foot view from a drone or something, is Worcester better off for the Thayer family having passed our way. So those are the kind of four things, and I'd love to hear questions with people like Harry Dewey here, who probably know a lot of this stuff. I'm not going to be able to elaborate and make it as grand as I would like to. I'll just try to stick to the facts. So to start off, just a couple of some dates. 1492 is when Columbus came to America, and if he hadn't discovered America, we wouldn't be talking about any of this. Thayer was, Scofield was born in 1889. He was the only son of Edward Thayer and his wife, Florence Scofield Thayer. In 1909, life changed dramatically for him. His father, Edward Thayer, ran Thayer Woolen Mills. His grandfather had started the company and he had expanded it. And as my dad said, by age 40, this was Edward Thayer, he combined a nice start, silver spoon of sorts from his father, with an inveterate genius and a thorough knowledge of the woolen business, such that he became known as the largest manufacturer of wooden goods in the country, not in Massachusetts, not in New England, in the country. He had mills in Worcester and surrounding towns, and I think even further, was very, very profitable. Unfortunately, he had the opportunity, but never took the opportunity to come to Gage, Hamilton and June, which is the predecessor firm of Fletcher, Tilton Whipple, to talk about and execute an estate plan. In fact, even worse, he didn't talk to anyone at Bowditch or Myrick either, or if he did, nothing came of it, because when he died suddenly in 1907, he had no will. So his son Thayer was 17 years old and was at Milton Academy. His wife, because there was no will, there's what's called an intestacy statutes in every state, which provide you a will of sorts, which says where your property will go if you don't leave a will, and it's based on family and closeness of family. So Mrs. Thayer, who was already well off, suddenly became a very wealthy lady. She got a third of the estate. The other 2/3 went to their children, and since there was only one, Scofield at the age of 17 became very, very, very wealthy. He went on to Harvard and was very involved with the arts. He met two people there that will be played a role in his life later on. One was a classmate with Edward Estlin Cummings. Another one was a guy named, I can't remember his name, but he went off to New York where Scofield went and became a co-owner of the Dial magazine. In 1916, he married Elaine Orr. In 1918, they had their only child, a girl, Nancy, and they celebrated a year later in 1919 with Elaine divorcing him in Paris, but it was an amicable divorce, and that was the same year that he bought the Dial magazine. And there's some conjecture that the Dial magazine became his mistress, if you will, rather than Elaine, but it was an amicable divorce. 1924 was the year in which the traveling exhibition of some of his artwork came to Worcester. And then in 25, he executed a will in New York City where he lived. And he then resigned the editorship of Dial after about 10 years. His health deteriorated. His health had always been an issue. He was very concerned and interested in his mental health. and he did consult with a guy named Sigmund Freud, who wasn't able to help him out much actually, but got paid for it. And I think at one point there was some statement that Freud made basically saying, you don't even want to try and get well. In 1930, he came back to Worcester, was sort of brought back to Worcester. His mother sort of sent a guy named Herman Rixius, who was one of the managers of one of his plants, down and knew him and brought him back. And later that year, he went into guardianship. His mother was appointed the guardian here in Worcester. And 52 years later, he died. So he's under guardianship for most of his life, 52 years, and spent the time living in Nantucket where they had a house, and then down in the Florida, I think in the cold weather months, he had a male servant that was with him all the time. So it was kind of a sad life, I think, for a lot of the life, but it was an interesting life. And let me get into that. At least I'm through with this life. I'm going to talk about it after his death. He left a will made in June of 1925. Major dispositions, personal effects went to his ex-wife, Elaine. All of his correspondence and literary productions went to a number of individuals who were associated with the Dial. His printed books and art portfolios went to Herman Rixius, who I mentioned. He had a collection of Aubrey Beardsley drawings, and they went to the Fogg Art Museum in Cambridge. And then he left his Dial art collection, which was the largest of his assets, to the Metropolitan Museum. And the residue of his estate, he left to 4 named individuals, unrelated, just named individuals. And there also was a provision that said, I make no provision for Nancy Cummings, formerly Nancy Thayer, his daughter, the adopted daughter of Edward Estlin Cummings, who actually was better known as E.E. Cummings, having made ample provisions for her benefit prior to such adoption by deed of trust. So his estate was about $22.5 million. This is in 1982. About 15,000, a little less than 15 million of it, I'm sorry, were deductible expenses, either expenses, fees, or charitable deductions. The appraisal was interesting, done by Sotheby's. It displayed the art on display at the Art Museum and held by the museum at about $12.5 million. It left his erotic art portfolio in storage at Worcester Storage at about $500,000. It valued a collection of prints and other artworks at the Art Museum for about $1.2 million. His Beardsley drawings at $500,000 at 50,000, and then a bunch of books, letters, manuscripts, etc., of about $300,000. So these were the assets. I said the residue of his estate went to 4 individuals: Elise Gregory, Marianne Moore, Robert von Erdberg, Robert Thomas Nickel. I have no idea who they were or where they lived, but they held the prospect of becoming rather wealthy because the residue of the estate was going to them. That's anything that's left over that isn't specifically devised, or anything that lapses because of a death or something. Now, if you leave $2 million to one of your children, and that child predeceases you, by law, there's a provision that says we promote and encourage family wealth being distributed. So if I'll pick on Phil Torgerson sitting there, if he's dead, then that $1 million he left to his 3 children or 4 children, Gail doesn't know about the other one, but those 3 children will share in the provision that Phil would have gotten if he'd lasted long enough. So if you look at Scofield's estate, the personal effects to his ex-wife Elaine, they were very close actually, but she didn't survive him. So that went into the residue. All the correspondence and literary productions to the named individuals at the Dial, none of them survived it. The printed books in our portfolios to Hermit Rixius, he didn't survive them. So all of those poured into the residue, which made the residue probably after taxes on the order of $5 million or something. Excuse me, yeah, $5 million. So you have these four individuals who are going to share it, but damned if they didn't all predecease. So you had no individuals who were left to take it. The Fog would take their collection, and the Met, which you'll hear about, might have taken their collection. So what happens to the 5 million? Well, that is now intestate property. And the first thing that was involved in the estate was to determine who are Scofield's heirs at law as of the date of his death in 1982. So that was interesting. So I mentioned that Nancy Thayer was their daughter. She was born to Elaine. There's some conflicting information about her, however. When E.E. Cummings, who subsequently, so I forgot to say that 2 years after their divorce, E.E. Cummings married his ex-wife, Elaine, and they lived happily. And they were actually all very good friends. After a long honeymoon, when Scofield and Elaine returned to New York, they immediately got two places. She lived in one apartment and he lived in the other apartment. Really lived separate lives. E.E. Cummings, who had been a lifelong friend of his since college, had written a long poem for their wedding, and they were very close. Scofield encouraged it. When he was away, and he was away for extended periods of time, he would encourage E.E. Cummings to look after and squire her around, would send her money to cover her expenses, because he had more money than E.E. Cummings did then. When E.E. and Cummings adopted Nancy, in the adoption papers, Scofield was named as the father, as in a couple of other things, but that wasn't very certain. And in fact, after the marriage, Elaine sent a letter to Scofield's mother saying, I regret to inform you that Scofield is not the father of my daughter. And so it was pretty sure that the father was E.E. Cummings, and he adopted him. So if that's the case, she is the closest heir in line. She gets the 5 million or whatever it is. So, but she had indicated, they had at least talked before, and it indicated that she may not. So what we decided to do was to not list her as an heir, but before we filed anything, we contacted Nancy, explained the situation, explained what the magnitude might be, and asked her what her position would be. And she wrote a lovely letter back and said, I don't want to make a claim against the estate, but I know you have a young lawyer in your firm named Warner Fletcher, and I would love to have the residue go to him. But Bob Whipple wouldn't let that happen. So anyway, now that she was out of the picture and she sent the letter, so we knew was the determination of who are his heirs at law. And you go up through the family. Are his parents around? No, the parents aren't. Then you go down to siblings of the parents and start coming down the family lines. So there were 6 family lines on Florence, the mother's side, there were 2. And on Edward's side, there were 4. On Florence's side, there was an uncle, James Scofield, who I don't think he married, but whether he did or not, his wife predeceased, he predeceased and had no children. He had another uncle, William Scofield, who will, as a teaser, we'll hear more about him later. Same thing, if he married, he was a bon vivant around Worcester, a wonderful guy. My dad said he was the first person you invite to any party, but he died, predeceased Scofield, and had no children. On Edward's side, he had a sister, Elaine Thayer, who never married, predeceased, no issue, of course, you think. An aunt, Lucy Thayer, a sister who also never married, predeceased, without any children. An uncle, Ernest Clary, who predeceased but had 2 sons, and a sister, Ellen Clary, who also was deceased but left a son and a daughter. So the 4 heirs were their 4 children. So with that, we proceeded to file the paperwork. We got some attorneys involved because Brownie Schwartwood came into the picture representing the 4 heirs. John Myrick, Jim's partner, was in the picture representing the Metropolitan Museum, and we were representing the settlement of the estate. So there was one thing I didn't tell you because I didn't think you were ready to handle it yet. The bequest to the Metropolitan Museum was a little more specific, and it said he left such pieces of his dial collection to the Metropolitan Museum as they would accept for permanent exhibition. So then the question became, what is permanent exhibition? And there was some discrepancy of opinion because the heirs took the position that permanent exhibition meant up on the wall. Anytime you go there, you can see it. And therefore, if that was the definition, if the museum said, no, we don't want to do that, we can't guarantee that, then the museum doesn't get the paintings go into the residue, and the heirs who are already making out are going to make out like huge bandits, good bandits, friendly bandits, but good bandits. The Metropolitan made the argument that permanent exhibition doesn't mean permanently up on the wall because you have conservation issues. Watercolors have to be stored in dark places, and you have to take the paintings down for, maintenance and cleaning and all of that, and study. So we decided to go to the judge and ask for his instructions as to the definition of permanent exhibit. And the judge was a Francis Conlon, who was a wonderful probate judge, just like a probate judge. He may not decide what you like, but he would appear to be listening to whatever you had to say ad nauseum, so that at least when you lost, and I'm talking about the other side, not our side, you would come away feeling, well, I may have lost, but the judge did listen to me. So after briefs and all of that, he rendered a decision which basically said permanent exhibition means on the walls that are added to the museum's permanent collection or are continuously exhibited in the museum's public auction galleries or in study display areas or in other facilities where they will be readily available to the public upon request for viewing or study, and that they may be removed. So that was a good resolution. I think that's a good interpretation. Everybody was happy with that. So we said, this is great. Everyone would accept it. We'll move forward. Joy reigned in Mudville. However, so everything was great for about 3 weeks. And then Bob Whipple came into the office one day and he said, Warner, could I talk with you? I said, sure. He said, we have a development in the Scofield Thayer estate. We have a suggestion of an additional heir, which has been filed in the probate court on behalf of a gentleman named Frank Lee Dixon of Fontana, California. And he acclaimed, as I said, we'd gone through the heirs, and Ellen Thayer was one of the sisters of Edward Thayer, his father, who had never married, died in Norwalk, Connecticut as a spinster. Well, Mr. Dixon claimed to be the adopted son of Ellen Thayer, which, if that was to be the case, then legally adopted child would be treated as your one's children. So he would step in as a fifth heir in addition to the other four, which meant that their windfall would be divided 5 ways instead of 4. So needless to say, this engendered a lot of discussion. The heirs hired Pinkerton to kind of look into and see what they could find out about this guy. He didn't really remember where he was adopted. He had been adopted as a child, had lived with Ellen, but we did find out a few things. We did find out where she died. She died in Norwalk, Connecticut, and we checked out the probate in her will. And in her will, she did leave $5,000 to her adopted son, Frank Stansbury, and $5,000 to a bunch of other people. But we didn't find anything else. She also left the residue for her house, a grand house, to a friend named Hildegard Nagel. So we found out about her. She was then 96 years old, living in a nursing home with a very vague memory. We did talk with her, but she couldn't remember anything. So the investigation proceeded. They found that Mr. Dixon hadn't been a pillar of virtue or a major success. He'd filed bankruptcy, I think, once, and had been kind of not a distinguished citizen. But in March 1st of 1984, Bob got a call from a woman named Mrs. Dean in Marion, Mass., who was a niece of this Hildegard Nagel who'd gotten the house. And when she'd gone to the nursing home, she had taken a whole bunch of papers that Hildegard had, and she said she was just going through them, and she called Mr. Whipple to say that she'd come across a certificate of adoption, which appeared to be the certificate of adoption by her aunt of a guy named Frank Stansbury. And would Mr. Whipple be interested? And he said, are you going to be home tomorrow? And she said, yes. So the next morning he road tripped down to Marion, and lo and behold, she had an original certified copy of this certificate of adoption that her aunt had kept through the surrogates court in Manhattan, where she had lived. And we checked out the surrogates court, and it turned out that, yes, she had adopted this guy, Frank Stansbury. Why she ever did that, who knows? But she'd done it. So then the only question was was Frank Stansbury and Frank Lee Dixon one and the same individual? We went back and forth on that, and fortunately for him, he'd served in the Navy, which is a great place for men to grow up, people to grow up and become wonderful husbands, fathers, all like that. But in his discharge, they had his fingerprint, and the fingerprint of Mr. Stansbury did match the fingerprint of Mr. Dixon. So that kind of closed the case, though there ensued some back and forth between the heirs and the attorney for Mr. Dixon as to what they would do, and they ended up buying Mr. Stanton off for $800,000. So he agreed to take $800,000. We had that issue resolved. Now at last, all was well in the land of the estate of Scofield Thayer, and all was well in Mudville. So we thought. So those are two, that's an issue, the issue of intestacy and the issue of an additional heir that was turned up. We'd never seen that before, neither had Bob Whipple. So one of the things that happens in settling an estate is that's a revenue producing opportunity for Uncle Sam. And in our case, if you live in Massachusetts, on Commonwealth. There may be state taxes due depending on the amount of the estate and who it goes to. So, and those returns are due to be filed 9 months after the date of death. We had prepared federal estate tax returns and Massachusetts estate tax returns and sent them off, and they were filed and prepared by us, so they had to be accurate. We wouldn't make any mistakes. And the way it happens, that once that happens, you wait. And the federal authorities are the first ones to review it. And after they finished reviewing it, they get back and give you a closing letter, or first they say we have some disagreements and you resolve those. And then they give you a closing letter saying, this is what was due, it's been paid, thank you very much. Well, they don't say thank you, they just say it's been paid. And then you forward that letter on to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And what they usually do, if the feds make any changes that are favorable to the Commonwealth in bringing out some additional tax revenue, they adopt them, and you go through the same process with them. And there was a IRS agent named Frank Piscopo, who was well known to any of the estate planning, probably Harry remembers him. Very good guy, very reasonable to work with, very fair and personable. Well, he rendered his decision about a week later or a month later, in which he disallowed the entire charitable bequest as a charitable deduction to the Metropolitan Museum, which if the heir issue had raised consternation, this raised universal consternation amongst everyone, especially the heirs. And the reason we had done this, we had gone to the purpose of getting the instructions from the judges, that the museum had agreed to accept the bequest, but they wouldn't say what they were going to do with it. So that was why we got into the dispute, the discussion, looking for the interpretation of permanent exhibition. So this was shocking. We never had this, nothing like, I think Mr. Piscopo must have gotten out of bed on the wrong side of the bed the morning that he rendered this decision. But his position was that the determination of whether there should be a charitable deduction or not is made as of the decedent's death. And as of the decedent's death, because the bequest to the Metropolitan Museum says they get such artwork that they will accept for permanent exhibition, we didn't know whether they'd accept any of the artwork at the time of Scofield's death. Therefore, even though they accepted it later, it wouldn't be entitled to a charitable deduction. That's like if they were left my collection of part of my art, they probably wouldn't accept much of it. The effect of that, since that amount not going to them would then go into the residue, and that would result in about another $7 million of estate taxes, probably. What was worse is that because it came in this debt, since they'd agreed to accept it, they would get the artwork, but the estate wouldn't get the charitable deduction and would owe another $7 million or so in estate taxes. And the residue was about $5 or $6 million. So the heirs were kind of looking at having a Pyrrhic victory here of being named heirs in an estate that was worth a lot of money for what the heirs would get, and then not getting anything. So anyway, we appealed it to the appellate level, and they listened to the sage arguments that all of us made and reversed Mr. Piscopo's opinion so that Joy came back to Mudville 9 after that decision. And we kind of felt that was the end of the estate. So we'd had 3 issues we'd never had before. However, it appeared that Mr. Thayer had not, at Mudville, that hadn't been a home run quite yet. Now I've got to find excuse me. Oh, the final footnote. So this is in 1987. He died in 1982. We're now in April of 1987. And Bob Whipple asked me to come in to see him on the morning of April 1st, 1987. And he said, close the door, and I closed the door. And he said, we have another potential unnamed heir. And I said, what? I've never seen one of these in my life, and now we've got 2 in the same. He had received a call out of the blue from a lady named Mrs. Carol Olson in Lafayette, California. And her mother was Eunice, this is a great name, Eunice Miller Eckelberger Ingalls, and her aunt was Daphne Miller Capodonico. And they had recently learned of Scofield's death, and they were related to Scofield through his mother's side. And as Bob said to me, he said, well, I dismiss this because it's April 1st. So I basically said, okay, who are you? What's this joke? And it turned out it was not a joke. They were serious. So they provided the information they had, and it turned out that they had a long family tree. They could trace their lineage back to Jean-Baptiste Hoche, another name that I'll mention later on, who was a French army officer who came to America in 1777 as part of Lafayette's troop to help in the war then going on as mercenaries. So there were some anxious moments, but fortunately, after further investigation, we determined that they were heirs of Scofield Thayer. However, by the way they do it, they stood in the 8th degree of kindred to Scofield, and the other 4, the Clarys, and then were at the 5th degree. So we informed Mrs. Olson that we have looked at it, and it appears that they are heirs, but they're not close enough heirs, and they would not be entitled to take anything. We said that that's something they should decide, and they later called back and said they understood, and there was you might have, if you were around here, you might have heard the coming out of everyone. So that was the end of the settlement of the estate, which was interesting, and we'll never have one again like it. So, but there were a couple of other issues that sort of been bandied around. One of them was, in which I haven't told you, but when Thayer went under guardianship, he had mental issues and was brought back to Worcester by Herman Ritzius. and was here for a very short period of time, before which they took out guardianship papers and his mother was named his guardian. And then the issue came, what do you do with his stuff? He had a huge apartment. He had his collection of art that he had collected, which was avant-garde at the time. Some disreputable people like a guy named Pablo Picasso, George Braque, Miro, other ones like that. But what to do with it? So she was good friends in the social circles in Worcester, familiar with the art museum, supportive of it, and knew Francis Henry Taylor, who was the new museum director there in '31. So they struck up a conversation and struck a deal that she would deliver the art collection to the museum for on loan. So over the next 31, 35, and 36, they cleaned out his apartment and all of the artwork came up to the museum. The drawings for the Beardsley drawings went to the Fog. His collection of erotic art, his paperwork, his letters, and all of that went to Worcester Storage Company, where they remained for some 50 years. And the exhibition, or what became known as the Dial Collection, was a major piece of the art museum's collection. And it represented a lot of work that the museum probably didn't have, because these were newer art names, not yet well recognized. Scofield may have had a lot of mental problems, but he was very astute in the matter of this kind of artwork. So it stayed there for a long period of time, but in 1924, Scofield felt that he wanted to promote a book that he'd done on some of this artwork and help these young struggling artists. He bought their artwork in part because he had plenty of money, and he was helping them by buying their paintings and drawings and such. So he put this show together and wanted to travel it around, and there was a gallery in New York City that showed it, and the second stop for 3 weeks in 1924 was in Worcester. Well, it came to the museum, and they allowed it to be showed, but they refused to show a Picasso painting and a nude by Braque, which I think bothered him, but the most of the show showed. And I don't know how it was reviewed or how it went, but shortly after the show ended, the Clark president, Atwood, was having his photograph painted by a painter named John Johansson, I think from New York. And in those days, at the Worcester Club, they had rooms, and I think he was staying in the Worcester Club and then going over to Clark and painting. And anyway, shortly after the exhibition ended, and the exhibition moved on to Smith College, where incidentally, they refused to show even more of the pieces. And there were a lot of museums that wouldn't even accept the exhibition, but that's another story. A reporter from the Telegram heard of Johansson and interviewed him about the exhibition and what he thought of it. And to put it mildly, Mr. Johansson was not very complimentary. He called the Dial magazine an intellectual sewer, and it got worse from there. He talked about paintings that someone like I could do. I put a few scratchings on a piece of paper, I sign my initials, and it's an inspired drawing of something. Scofield didn't take kindly to that when he heard it, but nothing really happened, and life went on. As the editor of the Dial, one of the the monthly pieces was a commentary by the editor on whatever he wanted to talk about. And in early 1925, he did give some response or rebuttal to Johansson's comments, and they were not quite as bad as Johansson's, but you knew what Scofield thought about him or didn't think about him. And then in June of 2025, he executed a will. And the will left his art collection to the Metropolitan rather than to the museum in Worcester. And I think there was a lot of sentiment that this was unfair. A couple of the headlines in the Worcester papers: Thayer's will deals a blow to the art museum. Another one: few clues as to why wealthy collector should shun his native city. And I understand that sentiment, especially from people in Worcester, and especially people at the art museum. I don't know if Jim Willou was on this call, but I think the real reason is that he got upset with you, Jim, and pulled the assets from ever going to the museum, but that really isn't the case. He was a New Yorker. After he left college, he moved to New York. That was his life, the social circle there, the art circle there. His business was there, and that was related and tied intimately into art. He did visit Worcester occasionally to see his mom. His Dial collection was very important to him, and it was part of the New York ethos of the avant-garde art. So I don't think that the will leaving that art collection to the Metropolitan was really that surprising. I think it was it was unfortunate in two ways, I think. And I don't know this, but I think being at the museum for 50 years, people, I don't think, somehow never expected or understood that it might possibly go somewhere other than the Worcester Art Museum. And I wonder, but I don't know this, whether in their collection process over those 50 years where they were making other acquisitions, if they might not have looked, if they're looking at maybe getting a Picasso and said, well, no, we already have a Picasso or two from the Dial collection. We don't need another two. We really have another hole we'd like to fill. I don't know if that's the case, but if that was an influence in the collecting that the museum did over that long period of time, then that is truly a loss if they could have gotten some of these works that they lost when the Dial collection left. I think the other big loss was the fact that had that collection stayed at the Worcester Museum, more of it would have been on exhibition most of the time, and a lot more people would have seen it than they probably do at the Met, which not only doesn't show it all as often, they probably have God knows how many Matisses and Pizarros already. So these are just, an addition of one or two more. I don't think that my conclusion, which doesn't matter what I conclude, it doesn't matter what anybody concludes, but my conclusion after considering all of that is that this probably would have happened, and the little flap over the exhibition that arose probably didn't change Scofield Thayer's mind. It would have been interesting to know if he had a prior will and what that will said, but we don't know that, and it may well be that this was the first time he did a will. But at least he went to a lawyer and had a will done, which his father didn't. So the last thing I wanted to comment, and which I mentioned at the outset is, if we get up in a drone and fly around at 1,000 feet and look at this with more perspective, is Worcester better off for having the Thayers pass our way? And if the loss of the dial collection is somehow they're to blame because of what Scofield did, that's about the only downside that I see. I think on the other side of the coin, Edward Thayer, the father who took his father's woolen business and grew it, just think of what he provided for this city, not only with his various mills around, but all of the people in Worcester that were employed there. You think of all of the subsidiary industries that grew up that serviced manufacturers like them to help them fix their looms and all of this sort of stuff. All of that wouldn't have been here to the degree it was that Thayer had his success in his mill. And, you think of the businesses that probably were spun off, as happened throughout Worcester industry at that time, that also made this community a very vibrant place. And you think of the wealth that those owners like Thayer had and developed, how much of that went back to this community in so many ways. His wife, Florence Scofield, the Scofields were successful in their own right in this business. She inherited 1/3 of his estate outright. When she died, she did leave $250,000 to her son, Scofield, who didn't really need it, but she did that. To her son. But the bulk of her estate went to 12 charities in this city: the Art Museum, Clark, WPI. She was generous during her lifetime with gifts to the charities. So there was another example of the Thayers being very supportive of this community in other than just employing people. Mrs. Scofield had a brother, William Scofield, who I mentioned, who died without any children and predeceased. But he was an owner of a mill in his own right and was successful financially. The family had money, but he retired from that business and became very interested in arts in Worcester, at the Art Museum and others. As my dad, I said earlier, if you had a party, you wanted William Scofield to be there. He was just the life of the party. But when he died, he set up a small foundation called the Hoche Scofield Foundation. The Hoche name I mentioned came from 1777. But that's a foundation that continues today. We've had some bad trustees in the past. Harry Dewey was one of the worst. I don't know if he's still here. But that foundation continues today. It benefited 5 institutions in Worcester, half of the assets. The income goes to the Art Museum, the Music Worcester, Clark University, WPI, and another 10% went to City Hospital. Since City Hospital is no more, that income goes to health-related needs in the community, and the trustees make discretionary grants with the other half of the money. That was worth about $7 million when Scofield died. It's now a $21 million foundation. So that's another pretty good thing for having Thayer pass this way. Also, interestingly, in the last 10 or 15 years of Scofield's life, such as it was, his guardian, he was a lawyer down in Providence, successor guardian, made some major contributions to Worcester organizations, the Art Museum, monetary contributions over a number of years. That money didn't have to come here, but given that he had been born here, it went here rather than going to New York, which was and another benefit to this community that probably people don't realize. And I guess I would be remiss, there's one other. I've alluded to Mudville 9. There was one of the great poems of all time was called Casey at the Bat. And it's about Casey, who was a ball player. I don't know how many people who have read it. If you hadn't, you ought to go down to the title pool and buy several copies of it. But it was a poem about Casey at the bat, who is an accomplished hitter, and at the end he strikes out. But
so, are you hungry?
Oh, sorry. So that poem was written by a gentleman named Ernest Thayer. He was also a member of the Thayer family. So there's another thing that not only Worcester has gotten, but United States and even the world, this wonderful, wonderful poem, which probably we didn't realize came from Worcester. So I guess, and Worcester also got, for no good reason, 50 years of enjoying the Dyer collection at the museum here that wouldn't have ever come here if Scofield had ever had any say, because that wasn't a decision he made. So I get at the end of the day, I think there's no question that this, in addition to having a story of his life and settlement of his estate, which may or may not be interesting, the other benefits to this community far, far outweigh what the loss of the collection hurt the community, and I think continue to benefit this community in meaningful ways. And I guess I'm done. So thank you. Don't clap. But if you have any questions.
Warner, that was wonderful, and I do want, I got to look, because we do have copies, a bunch of copies of Kate Back. So there we are. So that was the big plug.
Yeah, one other thing. I want to. Joe was telling me that each of you paid $1,000 to join this, and I appreciate it. We're having a little argument over how we're going to divide that up, but I still appreciate you kicking in like that.
Good techniques now. Excellent. So wonderful. So if people have questions or comments or whatever, unmute and.
Or clarification.
Or,
no.
I have one quick thing. And Warner, that was absolutely fabulous. Louisa Dresser, who is our aunt, was hired by Francis Henry Taylor early 30s, and her career really spanned the greater part of that. And she would go down and did visit, I think, Scofield Thayer. I remember she told me years in the 70s, she was absolutely certain it was not going to come to the art museum. And Bob Whipple was her lawyer. I didn't think it leaks through that, but she said the explicit collecting policy was to assume it was not coming there. And she was laughing. She said that your uncle, they had a Picasso that he could not abide, but he was willing to help buy it. But their strategy was very much assuming that the dial was not going to come there. And the saddest thing, when I did go to the Met at one point, and a friend took me in the back, the dancer is, of course, still there. That's the one they show. But everything else is just buried in those vaults. And so I did think it's a sad story for the public, not necessarily for Worcester. But anyway, I think the museum was pretty smart about how they did it. Didn't have the money to keep up, but they did collect. And Chip Riley and there are other people that kind of stepped in to kind of fill in parts that the dial had.
Yeah.
So Warner, the check is in the mail. Don't worry about that. But
certified, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. But hopefully not too tangentially. I wonder whether he was also related to Judge Webster Thayer, who many may know, but others may not, was a Worcester judge who presided over the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, who has a very, very controversial legacy because of the way that trial was handled. Any thoughts?
I don't have any idea, but his last name is Thayer, and
Jim, they were distantly related, actually.
Okay.
They were distantly related.
Right.
That line.
Not close.
But yeah, but they were distantly related, yes.
Interesting.
Warner, did he have an established psychiatric diagnosis besides insane, which is not terribly clinically relevant? My guess is he was a late onset schizophrenic.
That's what I thought, but no. You know, when he went down to New York, he would travel to find out about art. And one of his trips around in 21, I think, was an extended trip to Vienna in Germany to learn about German art. But my dad opined that he maybe had as big an interest of going there and meeting Sigmund Freud and seeing if he could retain him to help him. And I think he paid Sigmund, so I think Freud was very happy to. I don't know what the nature of the problem was, but it did get more severe. And when he was put under guardianship in 1930, I don't know what the reason was, but I don't think there was much dispute that he was really not capable of managing his affairs.
Well, if it were schizophrenic, that may have helped him appreciate early modern art.
Okay. Okay, maybe.
Those images may have looked perfectly normal to him.
Well, doctors that we've spoken to actually have looked at whatever medical files are available, sort of gone back in time and done a forensic analysis and have concluded that, yes, indeed, he suffered from late paranoid schizophrenia and onset paranoid schizophrenia, which actually manifested itself quite early on in the 20s, around the time all this upset was happening, the intellectual sewer. And one thing, Warner, I think is worth pointing out too, is that this really grated on Thayer for years. And we have all these letters where he refers to John Johansson, and he's so mad at him that in his last editorial, Thayer's last editorial in the Dial, a year later, he's still thinking about this, and he lashes out at the Telegram at Worcester, says Worcester has the sensibility of an Alpine village, and meaning very unsophisticated. And then a month later, he wrote his will and left, of course, as we know, the art to the Met. What's another postscript to this, though, I'll just add, is there's a group of lawyers in Manhattan who are looking at certain cases, the case of Albert Barnes, and how the intentions of the owner, Mr. Barnes himself, were not honored. And they're looking at the Thayer case as well, because as someone pointed out, if you arrived at the Met today and said, gee, I'd like to see such and such a work of art, well, they're in the outer boroughs where a lot of the Met art is stored. I think there are only 3 or 4 pieces. The Matisse that someone referenced, there 1 or 2 Lachaises, but very little is on permanent display. So really they are legitimately in violation of what his intent was, or what his request was.
It was kind of like his mother leaving him $200,000. Him leaving all that artwork to the Met was a drop in the bucket in some ways. But
well, and it's, you make the good point. I mean, he had an incredible eye. And when you look at, for example, and I don't think very few people could do this, to choose these unknown artists. And every one of those artists that he chose is represented at MoMA, which is pretty amazing. I think very few people could go down to Chelsea and Soho in New York and go to a handful of galleries and pick people who 100 years from now are going to be basically the canon. I mean, the modern artists that we all revere. One other point I just want to make, the erotic art that you mentioned.
That's in my basement. I haven't gotten to look at it yet.
No, because the erotic art, that is actually what, and it's funny how times change. That was mainly the Egon Sheilas, which the Met put on display 2 years ago, the Obsession exhibit. It was the nudes by Egon Schiele, Gustav Klimt, and Picasso, and that collection. So we actually did an analysis of what is the Dahl collection worth today, given the inflation in the market. And I'm sorry to tell everybody, since it is not in Worcester, but conservatively about 310 million. Because again, the artists that he picked are all the considered the leading modern, whether it's Matisse or Sheila, Lachaise, Klimt, I mean, on and on it goes, Braque, etc. So,
he was a bon vivant in his own. I know my dad had some notes. They lived in a mansion, a big stone mansion on Elm Street, which has subsequently been torn down. But
Jonas Clark House.
What?
The Jonas Clark House.
Yeah. But he was the life of, and they had a lot of parties there. And he was the life of the party, apparently. Loved to dress up. And apparently one of the party was themed French provincial or something. And he showed up with dressed to the nines, but he had loafers on. And he walked in, and apparently when he met the host or whoever he was talking to, he says, "I apologize, I couldn't find the right some kind of shoes to wear, but this is all I could." But he had a good time, even if he had some mental issues, I think. And he wasn't, it's funny. I wonder if his parents, or no, his father died young, but whether his mother ever said, wouldn't it have been great if Scofield had gone into the woolen business just as his father and grandfather and carried on the tradition. And I wondered if he wasn't kind of looked at a little bit of a black sheep, especially if he didn't appreciate the kind of art that he was collecting and his lifestyle. And yet, if it's worth $310 million, he was a pretty good investor too.
He was a good investor, and it's funny, he was actually in the first class at Bancroft. And from a young age, he was a writer. And his father wanted a more manly son. But from a very young age, and actually at Yale, at the Beinecke, they have these incredible little books that he made and sewed together with these very elaborate stories and drawings. But he said early on he had no interest in wool and manufacturing, and was going to do what he considered, he had a higher calling, which was art, writing, and poetry. And again, I think we can thank Scofield for legacies beyond Worcester, the Museum of Modern Art, which is, of course, the leading modern art institution in the world, arguably, and all these writers, such as you mentioned, Cummings, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, but many of these he published for the first time and gave these writers a national audience. And again, these are the writers, these are the people we still talk about today.
Yeah.
Warner?
Yeah.
You mentioned the application or petition to Judge Conlon. Throughout this process, was there any other adversarial litigation involved in this matter?
No, now you are. Now you're on. Now you're on. Be careful.
No, I mean, the adversarial, the request for instructions, the adversaries were Brownie Swartwood for the heirs and John Myrick for the Met. those were the only adversarial ones, other than Charlie Abdella represented Mr. Dixon. So, but this was enough. This is more than enough for one estate. It's kind of interesting though. I've never had any estate of any amount where there was an intestacy. And it's sort of interesting that here was an estate which was set up to avoid intestacy. There was a will, but because of the duration of his life, ended up not only having an intestate share, but a substantial intestate share. The four heirs got left with about just over $1 million, and Mr. Dixon had 800,000, and the 400, the four beneficiaries lived in the Worcester area, so that some of that stayed in this community, and the Worcester Storage Company got the annuity of 50 years plus of storage fees. So there were a lot of benefits that you don't come to mind right at off the top.
That's very funny.
Warner, I heard your father speak on this subject many years ago, and I heard your other partner,
Bob
Whipple, speak on it, which was so involved that he asked for an extension of time, which we gave him to speak in 2 installments. I want you to know that your presentation tonight was the clearest one I've heard yet. Very complicated.
You're losing it, Harry.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, certainly.
Once Thayer went into guardianship, was it ever at all possible for him to have a new will? Was it like?
Not in those days, probably not. Now I think it is possible if you can put together a compelling case why whatever his will or trust says is somehow not what he wanted. If there's other evidence you could bring in, but back in those days, I don't think I don't know when we became aware of the will. In other words, it was done in New York and it was held by a New York lawyer. With the benefit of hindsight, you could say, and it's probably too late to sue him for malpractice, but you could have said he should have pointed out to Thayer that if all of the named beneficiaries not being related to him were to predecease him, that property would go by intestacy, and that he should have left it to Paris Fletcher or his family or something like that. But that didn't happen. So I don't know when the will was turned over to our office actually, but I think it was later on. But I think in those days, no one really thought about it.
But from what you say, it seems like you fell into a black hole once he went into guardianship. So it's nothing to be done at that point.
Yeah, in terms of whether he had a will, I don't know when we learned when he did have a will, and I don't think anybody thought to look at it and said, "Wait a minute, we think it should come to Worcester," and it isn't. So we got to come up with an argument why we should somehow reform the will.
And he had become, I was going to just add too, that he had been declared, you mentioned, Warner, the probate court hearings, etc. He had been declared an insane person in the early 30s. So I'm not sure if you were declared an insane person, if you could have made another will. I don't know if legally, if that's possible. And
I don't think it could have been. And frankly, when you look at the facts, the reason it came to Worcester is because his mother, 5 years after or 2 years after the guardianship, agreed, this is a place she could store his artwork. He wasn't consulted. So it wasn't even a decision that he'd made even on a temporary loan basis. He had nothing to do with that decision. And all of the other factors that lead to the New York-centric kind of consideration, I think, would have prevailed. Other than, the only possibility would be to again, I always wondered a bit how the guardianship got established here. And I guess I didn't realize that he had moved here at his mother's urging, taking him away to New York, claiming he was a domicile here. And then the guardianship proceedings were here. I suppose it would have been possible that a home court, if it was somehow presented, might have made a decision in light of the 50 years of temporary exhibition, but I don't think so, because the Met would have entitled to have their attorneys argue this, and I think that argument would have prevailed.
So
From Florida.
Is there anybody else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
The house was at 38 Elm Street. Do you know if that stone structure that's in the parking lot of the Historical Museum was part of the house at 38 Elm Street?
I don't have the foggiest idea whether it was. Never even thought, I did see a picture. There was a picture in the exhibition piece that went with the exhibition of the erotic art that the Met did. There's a picture of the house, and it's, I guess, as I'm thinking about it, the stonework is somewhat similar,
Right.
but I don't really know that.
I know it was not.
It was not, okay.
It was, I can add, it was part of a house that fronted on Chestnut Street that was owned by the Stone family.
Mhm.
The Stone
Okay.
house for the Stone family.
Okay.
One other quick thing, his partner Sibley Watson was actually connected to the Whitens and Lascelles, who are also textile machinery, but it's kind of intriguing. And he was he kept his brains to him, but they were really hand in hand. And Caroline knows this probably more than I, but he did a lot of work in photography, a whole series of other things, in addition to having this literary sensibility that was really quite amazing. So they were kind of impressive. And I also be curious to hear from Jim, because my recollection is that that when Alfred Barr was teaching at Wellesley, he brought his Wellesley students to Worcester to see modern art, because you couldn't see it at the MFA, even there were a lot of progressive collectors. The MFA was much more kind of conservative. And Worcester had done not as much maybe as the Wadsworth eventually did, but it was more amenable to that stuff. Not that the Scofield Thayer had any clue about it, but it was, there were things, the Gauguin, the Monet, there was more kind of openness to things than the MFA had at that time, interestingly.
No, there's no question, Jacques, that Worcester was a real leader in this country for contemporary art, particularly in the 20s, the late teens and the 20s, under our director who bought the Gauguin 100 years ago this year for $7,000. It really was. And you're right. Barr did say to his Wellesley students, go out to Worcester if you want to see contemporary art, because Boston was very conservative, as you probably know. And the irony of it is that the Metropolitan Museum would never have been exhibiting this material when Worcester was exhibiting.
That's why MoMA was created.
There was a great piece in the New Yorker not too long ago. It said the Met's biggest mistake was MoMA, because they were slow to pick up on the
Very slow,
art
absolutely.
trend. Yeah.
Catching up at great expense.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
That was great.
So very much. This is absolutely fabulous, Warner, and so much good discussion afterwards. So I really, really appreciate all of that. That was wonderful. And Warner, if you ever have any other cases that you'd like to share or get some advice on, you know where you can come. We're here, ready for you.
Very discreet.
Well, this was a lot of fun, and I'm just, you will get me the check.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Okay,
They're gonna come flooding in tomorrow, I'm sure.